We are in the north of Italy, in Turin, with the celibates of the Chemin Neuf community. From the 11th until the 23rd of May 2010, over 2 million pilgrims will be making their way to the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist to look at one of the most mysterious objects in the Western world, the Shroud of Turin. The shroud has been kept here since 1578, where, from time to time, it is exhibited to the faithful.
It is a large sheet, about 4 meters long by 1 meter wide, on which you can see the image of a man, naked, from the front and from the back. He carries all the wounds of Christ. The entire flagellation can be seen.
I see a man who suffered an amazing torture. It's hard to imagine how one human can do this to another human. But it is a document of the passion of Jesus.
This linen cloth is the only one in the world on which you can see the exact impression of the body that was wrapped in it. A man who has been executed, about 180 centimeters tall, around 30 years old, with a beard and long hair. Over the centuries, this shroud has never ceased to defy science and its certainties. To this day, no one has been able to explain how this image came to be formed on this cloth. However, the numerous scientific and medical studies that have been made do throw some light onto the details that are invisible to the naked eye.
We have real blood, proven scientifically. We have an image that's neither painted, nor photographed, nor scorched, nor rubbed, or in any way made by the hand of a man. The image on the shroud is definitely not manufactured, meaning made intentionally to fool us.
This shroud has been wrapped around the body of a man who was tortured, flagellated, crowned with thorns, crucified, at the time of the Roman Empire. All of which corresponds to what the Gospels tell us concerning Jesus. But what is the origin of this shroud? Where does it come from? Its history is as mysterious as the history of the man whose face it bears. For, until the 14th century, we have no reliable trace of the shroud. It first appeared in 1357 at the Collegiate Church of Liry in France. It was declared to be the Shroud of Christ, thus attracting extensive crowds. Almost immediately, a debate erupted surrounding its authenticity. Throughout its history, the shroud has suffered a number of accidents. In 1532, when it belonged to the Duke of Savoy, it almost went up in smoke in Chambéry, and the image is still marked today by the water that saved it. It was then repaired by nuns, who stitched a backing cloth on to reinforce it, and put patches of linen on the places where there were burns. The shroud arrived in Turin in 1578, but very few people beyond the frontiers of Italy came to know about this fascinating image.
No one in the world really knew about it or cared about it. Then in 1898, an Italian photographer, Secondo Pia, made the first photograph of the shroud and discovered properties of this image that amazed him. And so the beginning of the scientific interest in the shroud was in about 1898 when Secondo Pia made the first photographs and showed that the image on the shroud is a negative. And when you photograph it and look at the negative, it's a positive that looks more natural. Now this is unlike any other photograph or image we've ever seen. So Secondo Pia opened the door to science.
I used to work for NASA, the space agency in America, and I'm very interested in how the image was formed on that cloth. We still don't know the answer to that. So I've been interested for many years in that ever since I was a little boy. I actually saw a TV show in Chicago, Illinois, in America when I was about 8 or 9 years old on the shroud. I was fascinated.
The Shroud of Turin provides a great challenge for science. It's a challenge because it's a piece of cloth that contains an image with physical properties unlike any other image I have ever seen or anyone has ever seen. I have spent 32 years studying it. 32 years, half my life studying it, and yet I still don't have the answers.
Barry Schwartz is American and a scientific photographer. He is escorting a group of pilgrims from the United States for a few days in Turin. His story with the shroud began in 1976, just as he had finished working on a research project in Los Alamos National Laboratory, one of the best-known laboratories in the United States.
The man I worked with from Los Alamos called me again, and he said, "Barry, what do you know about the Shroud of Turin?" And I laughed. I said, "But I'm Jewish." And he said, "Me too." He was also Jewish. And he said, and explained to me that at that point a number of scientists had taken a photo of the shroud, and he said they were so amazed that this image has such properties, they were going to put together a team of scientists to see if they could get permission to go to Turin and examine the shroud to try and determine how this image was formed. About 2 months into the project, I remember saying to one of the other team members, "What is a Jewish boy like me doing on this?" And he laughed and he said, "You forgot that the man on the shroud is Jewish?" And I said, "No, I know this, I know." And then he gave me the best advice, maybe, of my whole life. He said, "Barry, go to Turin, do the best job you can do. God doesn't tell us in advance what the plan is, but one day you'll know." And this was great advice. And that kept me on the team. I was going to quit. But because of his words, from God maybe, through his lips, I stayed on the team.
This is how, from the 9th of October 1978, this team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, made up of some 40 scientific specialists, travelled to Turin along with 6 tons of sophisticated scientific equipment. The scientists were only given 5 days, and they worked day and night in order to perform thousands of tests on the shroud. They examined it with infrared radiation under ultraviolet lighting. They took samples of the dust, all with a single goal: to understand how the image had been formed on the shroud.
Interestingly enough, after all the work we did and all the study we did, we could tell you what it's not. Not a painting, not a photograph, not a scorch, not an etching, not a rubbing. But we couldn't answer the one question we went to ask, which is, how is the image formed?
The team established that the sheet was made only of linen fibres, finely woven in a herringbone weave, and that the dark stains which formed the image on the surface originated from an oxidation and dehydration of the fibres of the shroud.
This image, it is extremely superficial. That is to say, it only appears on one surface. It does not go through the material at all. This straw yellow color, we're talking about a layer which is really extremely thin, something in the order of 10 to 20 nanometers. That is finer than a hair, something extremely difficult to see under a microscope.
But the most important property of the shroud's image is the fact that the distance between the cloth and the body made the density of the image change. So the closer it was, the darker the image. The further away, the lighter the image. So the image on the shroud is not just from contact, because it worked at a distance from the body. So the correlation of cloth to body distance yielded different densities of the image. So when we looked at it with the VP8, we saw the natural relief of a human form. Now, how do we make images like that? We cannot duplicate this. And this three-dimensional information is the only image in the world that has this property.
This image, imprinted on the shroud, was revealed in even more detailed relief in 2005, when it was transformed into a three-dimensional image. This was achieved by Dr. Soons, a doctor in Panama in Central America, who specializes in three-dimensional imaging. This image, which seems to have inspired works of art since the 6th century, has been created by the interaction between a real body and the material that covered it. But whose body is it? How did this man die? Did he experience crucifixion? That abominable end that was reserved for criminals and slaves in Roman society? The scientists studied the spots bearing apparent bloodstains and made a startling discovery. These marks carry the chemical signature of real blood. The team had thus established a link with the crucifixion.
The thing that stopped me from accepting the shroud as authentic for years, 18 years, the blood on the shroud is still red. Old blood should be black or brown. And no one could answer for 18 years, why is the blood on the shroud still red? And then in 1995, in a telephone conversation with Dr. Alan Adler, Jewish blood chemist, who proved, by the way, the blood on the shroud was blood, proved it. He and I were on the telephone just having a conversation. And then he told me something I'd never known before. When someone is tortured over an extended period of time, 24 hours, 36 hours, right around the time of Jesus' torture, the body goes into shock. Jesus was given no water, he was beaten, he was scourged. Consequently, he went into anaphylactic shock. After a period of time in this type of shock, the cell walls of the red blood cells begin to break down. And the liver floods the body, the bloodstream, with an enzyme called bilirubin. And when that happens, the blood stays red forever. And when I found that out, that was the last piece of the puzzle. And that pushed me over the threshold and allowed me to accept the Shroud as authentic, because it gave me a scientific, credible answer to the last question I had. My life is better by 1,000% than before, because the Shroud is in my life. So as a Jew, maybe the greatest irony from my life, I'm a Jew who can say that my faith in God was restored by my study of the Shroud of Turin. So the Shroud isn't just for Christians, it's for everyone.
The clues that had been brought to light by the scientific research now made a medical examination of the image on the shroud possible. This examination revealed that this man had indeed been subjected to torture and that he had died by crucifixion.
We don't see a man that's just dead. We see a man whose face is swollen because his face was beaten. And you can actually see one cheek is more swollen than the other, but both are. There are scourge marks from a Roman flagrum, which was a whip with 3 leather thongs, and at the end of each was a lead weight that's shaped like a dumbbell, the weightlifters use. And his body is covered with these scourge marks, over 120.
In flagellation, as applied by the Romans, the blows not only tore the skin, but, as a result of their energy, which was absorbed in a few microseconds, they caused extremely serious internal lesions.
Extrêmement grave. C'est une torture abominable.
It is truly a horrible torture. This was a man who, at the end of the scourging, was going to die. His kidneys had ceased to function. He was losing liters of blood. He was completely dehydrated. The man on the cross had no more than a few hours left.
More amazingly, those crucifixion wounds in the hands, the bloodstains on the shroud show crucifixion through the wrist, because the Romans knew if they crucified in the palm, you could tear it loose. But if they nail you here, and the nail comes here, you can never pull this loose. We also see bloodstains covering his head, as if from a cap or crown of thorns. But not the beautiful things that the artists show us. Oh, the Roman soldiers were not going to take the time to weave a beautiful crown. They took a bush of thorns and smashed it onto his head, causing bleeding all over his head.
Every thorn that touched his flesh would have been like an electric shock for a few seconds or even several minutes. We can hardly imagine this when we read in the Gospels, they crucified him.
And we see a wound on his side. The darkest blood stain on the entire shroud is from this wound. And the blood actually went around to his back. So we have this bloody cloth with all these wounds, and it is a perfect match to what it tells in the Gospels was done to Jesus.
This is Jesus. This is his testimony. Here is what I have done for you. Here is what the Gospels say. Here is what I'm saying. I confirm them. Here is what I have done.
However, in 1988, scientists tried to determine the age of the shroud. They took a small sample of the shroud and submitted it to a carbon dating test. The verdict was given. The linen dated from the 14th century. The origin of the shroud was put between 1260 and 1390. Despite all the previous research, the shroud was a fake from the Middle Ages made by a genius. This astounding result made major headlines in the world's newspapers.
I think the biggest frustration for those of us who had studied the shroud before the carbon dating was that all the evidence pointed to it being authentic. And there were hundreds of tests performed of different types. And then this one test comes along with a result that's completely in the other direction of everything else. If we took all the evidence that exists for the shroud or against it, and you put it on a scale and weigh it, 99% would say authentic, 1% would say not.
Today, there are several theories that could explain the results of the carbon dating test. Notably, that of Ray Rogers, an eminent American chemist and a member of STURP. According to him, the sample taken may not have been representative of the whole of the linen shroud. In 2005, he published a paper in one of the most influential chemistry journals, stating that the place from which the sample had been taken contained some threads of cotton that had been added later. The original linen would have been repaired during the 14th century with completely different threads of cotton. And these repairs would have been done with great care, making them impossible to see. There is another theory that could explain the results of the carbon dating test. This theory posits that the fabric itself has been rejuvenated by an emission of nuclear particles.
And so now, what are we left with? We're left with a radiocarbon date based on an anomalous sample that did not represent the main body of the shroud's cloth. And because of that, the radiocarbon dating of 1988 needs to be set aside and perhaps a new dating done at some point in the future. But I have to say one more thing. There is something called faith, and there comes a point with the shroud where science stops. In the end, Each person must look at the shroud and decide for himself in his own heart what it means to himself. The shroud did not come with instructions, with a book that tells us what to believe. And I don't know that the answer is on the shroud, but in the eye and the heart of those that look upon it.
Beatrice Guepro is married and a mother of 5. She lives in France, in Paris. Her experience with the shroud took her to a place where she never imagined she would go. She is today the vice president of the association Show Your Face to Us, and spends time going to different countries. She tries to spread the light which, for her, pours from the shroud and has come into her life.
When I was 20 years old, we went through a very difficult time in my family. Our mother fell seriously ill. We saw how powerless the doctors were to help her, and we watched her deterioration, her pain, and her death. For me, this was very hard. Our father, trying to help us, had the good idea of sending us, the 3 youngest in the family, to Assisi with the Franciscans for a sort of therapeutic trip.
During a stopover in Turin, Beatrice encountered 2 life-size reproductions of the shroud in the cathedral.
I was completely overwhelmed because a naked body, which had been tortured, with traces of blood which were only too visible, should really have made me want to run away. But funnily enough, this was not what I saw. I saw a body, more than just a body, a person who seemed infinitely reassuring, filled with peace. And this wave of peace reached out to me too. And I received a very deep and indelible certainty, as though he was right in front of me and he'd said to me, "Don't worry, suffering does not have the last word. Death will not swallow you up. I've been there before you." I could say that I met him. I could say, like Froissart, he exists, I've met him, this Jesus of 2,000 years ago. I can say that I've seen him face to face. And this wave of peace, I have to say that it's never left me, because whenever I look at him, I'm once again immersed in this peace. The Word was made flesh, the Logos. He who is the Word, he who is the truth, the life, he assumed a human body. He has placed himself within our reach so that we can reclaim our dignity. Surely it is our grief that he himself bore, our sorrows which he carried. It's as though he took the worst upon himself in order to allow us to breathe again and to continue to live after our difficulties and trials. He alone is able to transform our suffering. And the risen body came out of this fabric of death. And in the same way, he invites us to this same resurgence, this resurrection, And he shows us that we don't have to remain in the depths, but that his presence alone is itself a reassurance and can overcome anything. His hands are very beautiful. When I think that these are the hands which multiplied the loaves, which blessed the children and touched the blind, I see a man who is respectful, who is afraid of making me afraid. Because God is a little shy. He's shy because he's a beggar for our love. Our God, who is all-powerful, who could make the galaxies dance, is poor before me because he is waiting until I am ready to open my door for him.
Jesus says to me, "He did this for me." And what do I do for him? Jesus offers me his shroud. When I die, I will see Jesus. What will my shroud look like? Will it be pure white, proof of my selfishness, my inward-looking self? Or will it be stained with blood and sweat, proof of what I have done for others? That is what the Shroud of Turin means to me.
This month, let us pray for the Church, who is often suffering and humiliated in today's world. May she, in all circumstances, keep alive her hope in Jesus, he who calls us out of the darkness into his wonderful light. The word for this month is found in the letter to the Colossians, chapter 1, verses 15 to 19. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth. And he is the head of the body, the Church. He is the firstborn from among the dead, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him.